This is the second episode of the New Intelligence podcast here at 25th Century Magazine. And I have with me Adam Kingsmith of Emotive AI and also Toronto Metropolitan University. You may not know its current name that well, but you should, because it's the one not named after someone who committed genocide. And we're going to be talking about a few more issues, philosophical ideas about artificial intelligence, what it can do, what it can't do, and what developers may be trying to get it to do. So first thing I want to talk about, Adam, is having you introduce yourself a little bit alongside myself, Adam Riggio, the host of the New Intelligence podcast. Good to see you. And content editor at 25th Century Magazine. And so what I'd like you to do, first of all, is tell me a little bit about your project, Emotive AI, and how you think that fits into the greater landscape of artificial intelligence development.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think what we're trying to do with the project that I work on at EIQ Technologies is really just to try and help people better interface with their emotions. I mean, we do this particularly in like a mental health context. But again, the sense that like a lot of how we feel in our relationships with our bodies is not always like accessible to us, you know, like a lot of the mental health space is based around things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is highly reliant on like self-reporting. And so one of the things that got me interested in like emotion AI is like, what kinds of things can machines tell us about our bodies? What kinds of questions can we ask machines, and things like biometrics and that kind of technology? So the work I guess that I do is we try and develop tools, algorithms, processes that can kind of help us better understand the processes of the body and how they work. And I think it fits into the larger relationship to emotional AI, because I think the point of effective computing or emotion AI is to build systems that are about understanding and responding to human emotions, not to build machines that have their own emotions. I think there's a big difference there.
Yeah, because that's something that I think is one of the many misunderstandings in popular culture that exists about artificial intelligence, is the notion that it's meant to be this technology that creates an intelligence that is the same as humanity but is artificial. And that's not really what's going on, is it?
No, definitely not. I mean, even when we think about artificial intelligence, right, it's really like, at least now, what we really mean by AI is just like a long list of prompts, and you can just ask the machine, okay, if you find this thing, do this, and if it's not this, go to the next prompt, you know? And I mean, even things like ChatGPT, they're just like longer, better lists, more complex lists, but they're still just a series of lists, you know?
And we don't, the reason it seems so astonishing to us when we interact with something like ChatGPT in a way is because it moves through the list so fast that it produces output something like a human would tell you. Now, I mean, anybody who's played with ChatGPT long enough and critically enough will know that eventually it is the list of the output of someone who is kind of trying to BS you a little bit, potentially, right? But that ability to kind of simulate human thinking and human output, but while the underlying mechanisms doing it is so different from human thought, right? This is something that I think more and more people need to understand about AI and understand about machine learning, so that we can, know precisely what the proper application of it is in our lives, right? So when it comes to your work in this sort of emotional guidance space, right? We know that AI itself in your project isn't about replicating human emotion. We know it's not about replicating the human mind. It's not building a machine learning amygdala, right? But what is it about the human to artificial intelligence interaction that creates these therapeutic results, or at least can create these therapeutic results?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, like, at least my understanding, or when I talk to like my students about therapy, or even just like friends or other people, that it's about having like a kind of externalized subject or voice or interlocutor that you can kind of bounce ideas off, that's sort of outside your social sphere, outside your personal meta narratives of yourself. And so I think, again, in some ways, like, a good example of this is often when a therapist is asking a patient how they feel. The patient really struggles to actually articulate or put it into words. And sometimes if you have them wearing like a biometric device, they might say they're feeling kind of joyous, but the device is actually getting kind of a high level of anxiety. And so it's not that the person's wrong per se, but like we're introducing more data points, that external subject to bounce ideas off of into the equation that maybe just helps us to make more sense of how we feel. Because I think the personal narration is just unreliable, as you know.
In a way, it continues some of the sort of neuropsychological or biopsychological revolution, because I know the beginning of the science of psychology, right, at least in the Western traditions, began with this idea that one could know one's own mind entirely through self-consciousness and self-conscious reflection. And as we investigated more and more empirically about what the mind to body relationship was, and we discovered more and more gaps in our knowledge and our self-understanding that way. And it's something I experienced too when, I've done therapy and I've worked with therapists a lot over the years for my own mental health concerns. And one of the roadblocks that always gets experienced, and I think this is really true for sort of neuroatypical people like myself as well, which is most people don't know their own feelings, but shall we say, spicier your neuro is, the more difficult it can be to know your own feelings in real time. You might be able to better analyze it when you can sit back and think about a full history of things in an objective sense. But when a therapist has asked me how I feel in the moment thinking about something, and the kind of therapy that they're giving me is based on me being able to say directly and honestly, this actually is how I feel, me and that therapist don't end up working out. And I think I don't necessarily like to universalize my own experience because, you and I, outside of this podcast, have known each other on and off for quite some time.
Yeah.
You know what a weird guy I am. So it's I don't necessarily like to universalize about myself, but I think it is a very common experience, and the science bears this out, that even the most sort of self-consciously attuned people, if I could put it that way, don't always know in the moment what their experience really is. And that's just the matter of there are these autonomic processes in our body that go on that their regulation and their flows and dynamics have nothing whatsoever to do with the conscious and linguistic and cognitive and social thought processes that we use to express our personalities, right? And so how are some of the things you're developing going to help break through that boundary and connect self-conscious knowledge with these autonomic parts of our body?
Well, I mean, I think like there's a lot of potential in this field, which I still think quite a young space, right? Because like, there's the real-time feedback that you're talking about that ideally you can give people like linked up to their biorhythms. Maybe it's monitoring, and so as your heart rate starts to increase, it sends you an alert that you're like entering a certain state. So there's that level, right? But then also you can do kind of like long-term tracking to recognize maybe moods over time, and get people's sense of how they're feeling over weeks, over months. And so I think there's a lot of potential both kind of in the short-term feedback and the long-term feedback. And one of the things that we've been trying to think through a lot, right, is like the concept of big data can be problematic in this sense because, especially to your example of like being neuroatypical, right? Because a lot of algorithms are set to baselines that would be neurotypical, that would be based on a very kind of particular sense of what the subject is. And, so big data often brings people to bear on average baselines that are based around like a very hyper-normalized understanding of what a healthy human being is. And so we've been trying to think a lot about this idea of like, could you conceptualize something like little data? Could you create like a more boutique relationship to the data that's like synchronized to your particular biorhythms. So maybe you have to like wear this device for a week as it synchronizes to you before it starts giving you any actual feedback, because we want the baseline to be set to your biorhythms, not to like what the normal biorhythm is, you know? So that kind of stuff I think is quite interesting. And in these early stages, it's almost like the struggle for like creating space for there to be alternative baselines per se, instead of like universal baselines.
Yeah, because that seems to be one of the major issues when it comes to any kind of big data analysis, is this race. It's not a race to the bottom per se. It's more of a race to just like the top of the bell curve, the ultimate average.
You race to flatten, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And ignoring so many of these small variations. And that is a really loaded topic, because we can look at this in terms of, you know, the therapeutic angle, which is what your project is all about. When it comes to the therapeutic and figuring out how do we provide the necessary feedback about someone's state of mind, state of mental health, state of sort of psychophysical health. And then there is the other question of, you know, what are the political applications of these kind of ideas, which if we talk about that, we're going to be here for a ridiculously long amount of time, and we don't have the studio booked out for that long. But that is so much of an underlying ideology that, you know, playing to the universal average will make the variations disappear. And that is extremely problematic in so many different ways. So, this therapeutic angle, you know, one of the technological questions that I thought about it as you were describing this to me was, what is the threshold for enough data for a program like this to be actionable? Because I know how large language models have to be to produce something like ChatGPT, right? They have to be very large. They have to be so large that the training data is literally the set of everything that's been written on the internet, right? And that's why large language models are so limited when it comes to non-English languages, because most non-English and definitely non-Western languages haven't been on the internet long enough to generate enough data, right? So when we think about the technological limitations of machine learning this way, right? If there cannot be enough data generated to individualize therapy, right? How do you get enough data from, say, wearing or interacting with a device for a week or 2 weeks even, to really get that therapeutic process started? And how much will we have to rely on the pre-existing models that bias average amounts and that bias this overt normality?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of challenges there. You know, there's just so many challenges, even like at the base level of like wearability. Like, how do you get people to wear these things? You know, like if you're really serious about getting good feedback, you shouldn't use the wrist. You should be using like a chest strap that gives you HRV instead of the wrist using like it uses a kind of GSR. So it takes like a flash of your like skin cells and your blood cells, and it checks like the density, and that's how it gets your heart rate. So it's like the point is that it hypothesizes it, and there's actually quite a swing of error in that. So the initial challenge even around the data collection is if folks are really serious about getting good data, is you need to wear like a full chest strap, and you need to wear this like when you sleep. So even already there, it's like, by turning it into like a wrist strap or something, you're already starting to move away from accuracy. And the further you make it more kind of ergonomical and convenient, the more you move away from the accuracy, at least at this stage, right? So,
and the more you risk damaging the equipment too, which is also, you know, a major problem with all kinds of medical scans, even just basic heart monitor work, where, you know, one of the big benefits of a lot of medical technology that's wearable and that's about monitoring the body is how much punishment can this thing take? Because again, it's one of the signs of the infinite bounds of human creativity. I have known and spoken to and researched about healthcare workers and having to deal with the equipment damage when it's loaned out to patients for multi-day monitoring. And again, the kinds of things that humans do to these machines in terms of accidental destruction is honestly so creative that and so unanticipated and so surprising that it creates a huge technical problem on its own. The device comes back and they're like, how did this wire end up sticking out of this part of the box? How did this get turned inside out? Why is this catching on fire every time I plug it in? What did you do to this?
Yeah, exactly. So it needs to be durable, it needs to be portable, it needs to be affordable. And again, challenges that you don't think of when you're at the big scales. Okay, if it's a separate device from your phone, how is the information getting from the device to the phone? Is that information secure? How much are you taking? Are you taking a reading every 0.5 of a second, every 1/100th of a second? How much data are you taking? And these are all, because of the infancy of this field, there's not really it's still a lot of experimentation, I guess. Yeah. There's not really a good sense of what the standards are.
Because when you explain some of even the basic ways just a few minutes ago that you described to me how a machine would take some of this information from looking at the wrist, even just the basic description of that sounds fascinatingly complicated and really cool. And it's very advanced to be able to, actually measure things like the relative compression of cells caused by blood pressure.
Yeah.
And even that, which sounds incredibly interesting, really advanced. When you think through, gee, what must this have taken to develop this technology? And you imagine such incredible amounts of work would have developed this, and it's still not nearly as accurate as we need it to be.
Yeah, exactly.
These are the challenges that medical applications of AI and machine learning in general have to face so much. And, I think, or at least I get the idea that a lot of the hype around medical applications of AI are about convincing people this is all just around the corner. All of this technology is going to completely transform what's going to happen immediately, right? And that's either A, just not the case, or B, one small technological shift away from being the case. Like the invention of transformer technology in GPT itself, which is what made that kind of language anticipation possible, right? That was one kind of serendipitous technological advance that ended up creating this whole new mode of technology and this whole new mode of machine learning accuracy that the previous approaches to large language modeling and machine learning just could not figure out at all, right? So yeah, it's I guess that's one important skeptical point to make, which is, even though we hear so much hype about the artificial intelligence applications, there is so much problem solving in terms of practice left to do. So, I guess the last question I want to ask on this matter of, Emotive AI is this particular project you're working on at TMU or Toronto Met or however we're going to call them. It's young. They haven't figured out the nickname yet. And I don't know if you necessarily want to say this in a public venue. How far is it to actionability, and what are your imagined next stages of progress from where you are now to what you can realistically see yourself doing in the next 6 months, a year-ish?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting open questions there. We're operating in a space that's not, again, there's the medical space and there's the wellness space, and they're kind of adjacent, but in the same way, I guess the medical space is beholden to certain kinds of standardizations and norms. Wellness is a kind of a bit more wide open space, but I think the future of this kind of technology, I think, is an integration with things like maybe augmented reality, virtual reality, things like that. We're interested in working on this service as an API, so an application programmable interface. So for example, right, when Uber wants a mapping software. They don't make their own maps. They buy access from Google to the Google map and they put that in their software, right? And so we're looking at integrating like our mental health kind of tracking and monitoring technology as an algorithmic piece of software into other people's applications. So for example, if you have an app you want to start around like mental health, we can help you integrate that one piece that takes those biomarkers and gives you an emotional output. And then you integrate that into the games and the interface that you want to build on top of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, that again, it's really good to explain that, because I think those less visible elements of how computer technology functions today is something that I think more people need to really understand, because so much of the development, so much of the public face of technology development is only about the finished products and taking those finished consumer-ready products as completed packages, but not understanding how many other different business contracts and licensing arrangements and other ways of like putting the technology in there has been, even just legal ways of putting the technology in there, and legal arrangements and contractual arrangements and business arrangements get all pulled together into a single consumer product that depends on so many other people, right? And it's that background of how every single one of the components might have a company behind it and a business model behind it that is different from the consumer-focused model that we see. And I think that's something that we need to make clear. This is how Silicon Valley types of businesses function. And it's a really different character than all the previous approaches to business we might have put together in other industries in the past. Right?
For sure. And at the same time, there's like, I think it's both of those. It's kind of it's such a new sort of like future capturing industry. And then at the same time, as you said, there's always this kind of underbelly behind it. Like, for example, right, when you use Google Translate, it always gives the effect of like, oh, it's like this AI technology. But at the end of the day, there's people in developing countries being paid fractions of cents a word to audit it. So there's like this big kind of underbelly of alienated labor that is like driving this magical AI front face, this like invisible back end. And even to the example before when we were talking about ChatGPT, I asked it recently, like, how come you type it so it looks like you're a person typing it? Like you type it out slowly, as if you could just offer the text instantly. You don't have to make it seem like you're processing the ideas. And it said that was a design feature to make it appear like you're having more of a conversation with a person.
Yeah. And I can see that being a design feature that works well in, say, a lot of its customer service applications, because I know, because as I've looked at different transcription software just to make content for this very venue, right? One of the major corporate applications of chatbots, conversation-based AI, ChatGPT, other applications is being the front end of customer service lines to weed out those obvious questions and to weed out those obvious situations. Because, and again, if you're a reasonably technologically advanced person and you're listening to this show, most of the problems by the time you call into a call center, this has been my experience because I understand how computers work reasonably well. Most of the time when I have a problem big enough to call a customer service line, it's big enough that I need to escalate it to a senior person right after that initial screening level, right? Because that initial screener is just working through a script for the obvious things.
Yeah, did you plug it in? Did you restart it?
The standard sort of joke about IT's first questions, right? You start the tape rolling, boom. Did you turn it off and on? Is everything plugged in?
Yeah, exactly.
Is everything plugged into the right places, right? Do you remember what your password is?
Yeah, exactly.
And those, do you know how to reset a password? And those kinds of questions, right? And a lot of the sort of labor-saving elements of these applications are about trying to make conversationally reasonable products that can interact with people to solve the simple problems, right? And the issue then becomes, you know, for me personally, the issue then becomes, how soon can I get past this chat bot to the actual people that solve the more complex problems, right? And then the other problem, which is something that I think I will, to a degree, ask every guest about, is how much do the real limitations of the product match up with what an executive looking to employ the product in their company want to use it for, right? Because, again, a lot of the applications are pretty limited. A lot of the ways it can interact are not for the most advanced problems. It doesn't necessarily need to interact with the most advanced problems, right? But if you're dealing with a corporate leadership team that is mostly interested in labor saving as much as possible and cost saving as much as possible, now you have the problem of this technology being applied to so many levels of complexity above its weight, right? So what are some, I mean, as someone who's been working more in the, I guess, medical and psychological field of AI, right? Where do you think the threshold of its limitations kind of are? And where will the human and therapeutic input still need to be?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. You know, I think these things can be really useful tools. You know, I tell that to my students. I write about that in my work. I don't think that they're things that we should be like kind of always resisting or fighting against, but I guess it's how we use them, you know? And I guess the problem is often, you know, under the logics of capital, it's just looking for ways to save money and cut labor all the time. And it's interesting, right? Because, you know, when we met back in the day and I was thinking about AI then, everybody felt like it was going to take away the like banal labor jobs, like the fast food jobs, cleaning jobs, service jobs, like the jobs that are just kind of struggle, you know? And it's very interesting that it's actually replacing the intellectual labor jobs. You know, it's the artists, it's the writers, and, you know, it's the therapists. And there's already so many examples of thresholds being crossed in bad ways, you know? Like there was the recent case from, I think, March of this year, where this man in Belgium was interacting with like a chat GPT kind of, it wasn't chat GPT in particular, but like a language model bot.
Yeah.
And it drove him, so the stories say, you know, to suicidality essentially, like because of the relationship with the bot, you know? So I think that like it can't be a replacement, obviously, for some sort of like therapeutic interaction, you know? And in some ways it's almost like medically and socially irresponsible to treat it as such, you know, but it's cheap.
Yeah. And I mean, how much of this as well is justified by this notion of how this sort of governing notion of the large language model and this governing notion of big data of hypernormalization, right? That, you know, this is something that I was thinking about for other projects that I'm working on here, but I think it's still related, which is that there's an ideological element where in a lot of the tech industry, certainly not all, but quite a few participants, the less informed but still quite powerful actors who don't really take things like cultural production seriously, don't really take things like human variability seriously, who see the world almost entirely in terms of function and role and human activity only in terms of action and rest. You know, an issue that I was reading about with regard to the writers and actors strike, the Hollywood strikes going on, is that many executives at the studios now look at the content they produce for television as the second screen, right? As in the viewer is no longer conceived as actively engaged in watching the content and thinking about the content. They are instead doing whatever they are doing on their phone, periodically looking at the screen and almost in a half vegetative state, almost as if they're a depressed person sitting on a couch, bathed in the glow of their television, not really watching the third hour of NCISIA, FBI, PhD, DEA, etc. And instead is just absorbing content while their brain shuts off as they prepare to sleep for more work.
Yeah, it's like the white noise, you
Yes.
know? Yeah. I mean, the way you articulate it is very interesting. I've obviously thought about this often, you know, joke to friends like, oh, I actually really like this film. So instead of just putting it on and staring at my phone, I'm actually going to watch it. It's like a treat, you know? But like, yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, you know? And interesting is not the right word. It's a troubling phenomenon. And I think when we get to a place in the future, you know, like 4 or 5 years ago with Google Glass, they tried to make like your glasses as screens become a thing. And culturally, technologically, the leap didn't happen, but it will, right? Yeah. And already we're talking about what happens to our brains, our societies, our psyches, our mental health when we're on our screens 40% of the day, 50% of the day. What happens when our eyes are the screens, our contacts are the screens, our lenses are the screens, and we're on screens 80, 90% of the day. You know, it's gonna make us nostalgic for the time before, like now, you know, which seems bad relative. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because so much of this is bound up in questions of mental health as an individual, because being engaged with the world, being part of an active community that offers surprises and that offers stimulation and spurs to growth is a big part of creativity itself.
Absolutely.
And one of the things I think about with artificial intelligence applications is to what degree does the thinking about what they will do for our lives, how much will that focus on making more of our personalities reactive and vegetative rather than creative and spontaneous on their own? I mean, a lot of this is, you know, depending on which other of our semi-regular, what I hope will become our semi-regular guests will be on, is a focus on, you know, there will be applications of this that encourage creativity, but there's also this other side that has forgotten that human creativity exists in that sense. And with regard to the challenges in mental health, like what are the boundaries between what AI can do and what the person has to do themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, you know? I mean, I think there's that line in all fields, you know? We can talk about in spaces around art or even around research. Again, like, you know, ChatGPT can be an excellent tool in like helping me to understand a philosopher's text or a concept or an idea, but like it can't put the arguments together in a way that kind of makes a claim about the world that is kind of justifiable and defendable and situated in a context. And I think even in the space around mental health, you know, like AI can maybe help you be a resource to externalize some of your feelings and some of your challenges and problems, and, you know, ask the body directly instead of having to be processed through a kind of anxious, insecure subject of the society, you know? But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like it just brings me back to what you were saying before around the word community, you know, and these larger problems that I think exist. And I think like the loss of creativity and the loss of the desire to kind of want to be in the world is a natural outcome of a society in which our communities have been replaced by social media networks, you know, and like that is what community is now. So community is this deeply alienating, individuating experience. We're not spurred to that creativity, to that excitement, to wanting to be with other people, you know? And so it's almost like that zest for life is lost. And so we're outsourcing these last bits of humanity and calling it productivity and efficiency.
Yeah, because some of these social media platforms did for a while have the potential to augment human community rather than you know, individuate us even more, right? And we can, you know, there will be other podcasts where we can dig into the history of this in more detail, but it seems to me when I look at the development of these technologies and the human role in them, and you know how technology conditions our world, is that the community building aspects of social media and social platforms turned out to have political consequences that were potentially problematic for the profit margins of many of the companies actually developing them, and for many of the financial backers of the companies actually developing them, right? One of the big epochal moments of social platform networking was the revolutionary era of the early 2010s, right? And the blowback to that was algorithmic changes in how the platforms were applied that much more fragmented people and individuated them. And the sort of next epoch was this kind of counter revolution of aggressive voices becoming the most powerful on platforms, and of platforms being more about siloing people and fomenting conflict that became increasingly unsolvable, right? And putting people in contact with folks from different perspectives only in context, or increasingly in context, I guess I should say, because this is all about, when it comes to big data and large amounts of information, it's all about tendencies rather than absolutes. But the tendency tends more to expose you to just enough of a different perspective to make you mad at it, rather than to try to make you understand it.
Yeah, for sure. It's like an attention economy, right? And outrage and anger that drives clicks, that drives frustration. Even on the way over here, I was listening to a podcast this morning about like increased polarization in Canada, and how it's like, even when people would chat in like the House of Commons, it used to be much more civil and you'd try and negotiate. But now that everyone's being filmed and trying to create sound clips for like TikTok and Instagram for their constituents, everyone's just getting one-liners and being super zippy. And it's just creating this place where already a place that was quite devoid of meaningful political discourse has now become totally stripped of it. And it's just a series of individual influencer performer politicians jostling, for better position.
And it becomes difficult to know what a person's actual thoughts are when they have an interest in the attention economy, right? Like, one of the things about these politicians and these influencers is that I don't think they ever really say, when they're being recorded, what they actually believe or think and what their actual opinions are. Some of them are honest about this, but I think quite a few operators in this space just kind of have their sound bites that are engineered to get the most algorithmic attention, and to get the algorithms to pick up on the attention that is generated organically by the emotions of rage. But the actual substance of what they would do remains hidden, right? Like in the Canadian example, the conservative federal leader, Pierre Poilievre, went through a period in the wake of the Freedom Convoy especially, and throughout, since he gained the leadership in late 22 and 23, of being incredibly insulting and even refusing to answer questions from the CBC, from Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or from other organizations that were deemed too progressive in their points of view, or not biased enough towards a conservative point of view, solely towards delegitimizing them, right? And the likelihood that a Poilievre prime ministership would actually tear the CBC apart, privatize, and sell off the entire thing is actually very low, because of the way in which that institution is so deeply baked into the Canadian state, So he may make, as a talking point, as a sound bite, as a even a point in the party platform to be discussed, this radical, complete, and incredibly fast destruction of all liberal media in Canada, but then get into office and not really actually do it. And we would just see a repeat of what Canadians experienced in the Harper years, of a public broadcaster whose talking points and ideas and program profiles just start to lean more conservative for a while this party is in power. And yet the public vitriol among their supporters towards the institution remains, right? And so we end up with this situation of a polarized public increasingly putting their faith in leader after leader who promises change, but has no real interest in major changes at all.
For sure.
And the result of that happening over and over again that's potentially a really big political problem, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's where, to bring it back to AI, even in this context, like that's where I think there's some potential in some of these emerging technologies, even around like things like blockchain and stuff, is like, if we kind of agree that politics has largely become, at least in a place like this, very performative, just like candidates moving through, maintaining similar political lines, there's a lot of interesting stuff around things like blockchain and forms of like direct democracy and like voting verification. And like, let's just like, instead of having all these politicians do all these performative speech acts and all these layers of government, let's just like poll everybody in the neighborhood about this new road that we want to build and like use this technology to facilitate an actual aggregation of an individual's perspectives and just maybe cut out this layer, take that money and feed it back into fixing the system, like in a perfect world, those are some of the potentials that I think do exist. And again, I think a lot of the problems in our society is those limits of like the kind of capitalist imagination. All this technology, and all you can do with it is solve problems that already have been solved or don't even really exist in the first place.
Or that just amount to finding ways to cut human workers out of a system if you think they're starting to become too expensive for your bottom lines.
Exactly.
Right. I want to dig into some of the more philosophical elements that you brought up with me when we were preparing for this talk about what the role of technology is and can be and should be, especially the role of AI technology, but just the way we relate to our technology in general these days, and different perspectives of this to kind of push that limited capitalist imagination, that cheap capitalist imagination into different and more interesting and more long-term engaging territory. And I want to talk a little bit more about the philosophical elements of, how AI is used in our society, because your work in emotion and AI is putting this technology in a very intimate space. You don't get much more intimate with a person than the space where they are mentally most vulnerable, right? Mm-hmm. Because mental health therapy and knowledge of your own emotional and physical emotional states can sometimes make the difference between, whether someone has a rough time and goes about the day or whether someone's day features a suicide attempt, right? So that is a very intense place to put a technology whose powers and whose best uses and practices we are still figuring out, Mm-hmm. So one of the things in the notes that you sent to me as we were preparing for this podcast was a distinction between how we understand the role of our technology, and in particular, artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning, and modern computer technology, right? That relationship that we have historically thought of as use, as in computers and machine learning tech and AI are a thing that we use for particular purposes, right? And that is one dimension of it, and that dimension doesn't go away. But there's another aspect of this, which you brought up in your messages to me, which is about this is technology that exists alongside us, technology that itself becomes part of our environment and of the mediums we use to interact with our whole world and with each other. And concentrating on understanding the effects of that technology as an alongside, as an environmental element, that reveals very different things to us than if we just think about it as use value, doesn't it? So tell me a little bit about how you understand that difference and what does this alongside or environmental aspect mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conventional way of thinking about technology is as a tool, as something that we kind of use that extends like humans' capacity to accomplish like a task, And I think when we're thinking about these much more complex forms of technology, and again, if we use the kind of much more broad term around technology that's kind of Foucauldian sense of technologies are just things that help humans navigate the world. Language is a technology, you know? So if we think about technology as in that sense, if we think about digital tech in the way we think about language as a tech, you know, we think of it more maybe less of a thing that we use and more of a thing that we kind of co-constitute spaces with, or again, live alongside, like, because they're kind of always there and not just operating, but creating maybe mirror and feedback effects that kind of make us change our perspectives and think about how we see the world. You know, we've talked a little bit about how technology fragments public spheres and public discourses. You know, those are material examples of the technology enacting on the society in a way that's not just passive, you know? And so I think, yeah, this idea that tech kind of lives alongside us, not that it's alive in the way that humans are, not that it's a subject, but it's also not a passive object. And there has to be something in between those two, I think.
Yeah. This is something that I've come across in different parts of research where theorists are trying to look at computer technological systems and internet-based systems as social actors that are not human, as technological social actors, right? And it's, well, I mean, what do you think that means to you when you say that technology can be a social actor?
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess it opens up some questions around like intentionality maybe that I think are interesting. Like, do you have to have intent to be an actor, I wonder? Because I think if we say no, or if we say it can be ambiguous, then I think technology is a social actor in the way that it can help it structures perceptions of the world and how we are in it. You know, it's not just something that kind of like affects the world. It's something that can fundamentally change how we imagine it. And so I think in that sense, it sort of is a social actor. It has an influence on the social world that exists beyond the intended influences of the human operators or interfacers.
Yeah, because I mean, this is true about humans as well, right? Many of the effects that we as people have on not just the wider social world and our communities, but even just in the small scales of our interpersonal relationships, we are always dealing with the effects that are beyond the intentions of our actions. Whole genres of comedy, television, and art and writing are about navigating the unintentional effects of what we intentionally try to do and our intentional plans in society. I mean, this is Larry David's entire message to the world. Exactly. The fact that so much of our society and so much of our time being a person is spent navigating all of these unintentional and unintended consequences. So even though the ordinary meaning of the term actor implies I am acting, there is an intention in what I am doing, right? And the purpose of my action is unified with the intention, right? The effects of what you're doing and the power that your action has goes beyond your intention in ways that you often couldn't even conceive, right? Maybe you couldn't conceive of it because you aren't aware or can't really think of what a potential social reaction of another person could be, given their perspective, given their character, given their history, right? I don't think either of us or any of us listening or watching have to look far back in our memories to think about occasions where we've interacted with someone, whether it's a stranger or someone we know reasonably well, and we've said something or done something that we're pretty sure would be received in a certain way, and they have received it in an utterly different way entirely, right? And that's just dealing with other humans. So that example, that dimension of human life to me immediately takes apart this notion that action and intention have to go together. So now that we've broken apart action and intention, how do we trace social actions in terms of their effects and their causality, right? Causality becomes the real dimension here that matters, right? And I'm going to give you an example of this that literally comes from my reading of just a couple days ago. An article about this came from Pitchfork Media, an article about the boom in the United States in Spanish language, Latin, pop, and rap music, particularly genres that have been exclusive to Mexican culture for decades, but that are gaining increasing amounts of listeners in the United States because not of any humans seeking them out, or not because of any human record executives or leaders of touring companies coming up with new angles and new artists to promote. It's actually just because when the recommendation algorithms of streaming services look at people's history and they look at, say, Latin-tinged pop music or Latin-tinged rock music that people might listen to, which in the United States has been mainstream in Anglo-American culture since the 90s, right? That if you listen to some of that, it will start saying, if you like this kind of Latin music, maybe you'll like this other kind of Latin music, and bringing you into a path of increasing divergence from whatever form of music you were listening to before. And next thing you know, you are listening to music that by conventional or old-fashioned means of distribution, you would never have even thought to listen to before. People who did not even consider trumpets to be part of pop music are now listening to, semi-traditional narco corrido songs from northern Mexico in Spanish that they've never heard before in their lives and that they never would have otherwise been exposed to, because a recommendation engine began saying, here's some tangentially related but still close by artists and content, and getting just like slightly different divergent content in this direction as people keep enjoying what they're listening to in that direction. And that's a whole vector of cultural discovery that happens entirely because an algorithm was designed to recommend, if you like this kind of thing, here's something you haven't heard yet, but is similar. And increasing similarities eventually add up to a very, very large difference. And you have what essentially is the kind of social transformation that 30 years ago would have been a once in a generation thing, right? Entirely conditioned by the programming of a machine learning algorithm by a relatively low level artificial intelligence. And that's my long-winded example of saying this might be the kind of social action we are talking about. A machine that literally does not have intentions, that only has programmed interactions for the purpose of keeping people listening to music or listening to content on an app for longer and longer and more often.
In some ways, this is just an intensification of a kind of classic like marketing logic around like nudging, though, right? How do you get people to think that the things they want, it was their idea that they wanted it, right? And there's a lot of research that's been done into what YouTube did maybe 7 or 8 years ago, was they changed the logic of their algorithms so it no longer preferenced trying to get the most views, but actually trying to get people to watch the video for the longest amount of time. And when they changed that logic in the recommender algorithm, what they found is these rabbit holes people were getting pulled into were becoming like more and more right-wing and conspiratorial, because the kind of algorithm was unfolding in this unintended way, where it kind of really altered people's perception of the world. So it's interesting in relation to your example, which speaks to like an opening up of cultural possibilities, where most of the examples when I think or have seen of this is often like a closing or a siloing, So it's just a good reminder that they can kind of both be happening at once, And it brings back that question of intention again, right? Like, if I'm being nudged in my targeted advertisements on social media to desire a certain product, like when I buy that product, how much of that is my desire in the first place? It's almost like, isn't the algorithm actually the active social agent there because it's driving me to buy the thing? And am I not the passive social agent there because I'm just following the prompts and doing what I'm told?
Yeah. And yet this conversation has been had about advertising and marketing since it was first created.
Exactly.
Right? Because what is it? It's messaging on behalf of the corporation with a corporate interest in taking a reasonable amount of our money. And then moving that intensification into making messages that sort of nudge you in that direction to be more likely to buy this product rather than this other product, or to be more likely to start buying these types of products when you may never have thought you needed them before, right? And I'm reminded of the cultural tendency when I see, and I'm literally seeing this for the first time talking with you right now, when I see the similarity between this idea of the algorithmic recommendation nudge and the marketing message, catchy tune advertising jingle nudge, I am reminded that there is an arc that we have seen before. Because in the very early days of radio advertisements and the advertising industry and the marketing industry, right? People used to believe everything they heard on the radio, right? Here's one example that I discovered from the work of Emily Atkin, the environmentalist journalist, right? She was doing an investigation of the widespread belief in gas stoves and natural gas stoves as being the best type of stove there is. When you actually study and compare, modern induction stoves with, the old incandescent induction style burner stoves with gas flame stoves, right? The only real immediate benefit of the gas stove over all the other ones was that you flick the knob on the gas stove and you can take it to the exact temperature that you want and intensity of heat that you want almost immediately, which is why I think it's preferred in the short order cook industry. Whereas the other ones take time to heat up, but everything else about like energy efficiency and overall quality of product is better, right? And yet there is a common belief in North America, especially, that gas is always more efficient, that gas cooking and gas flame is always better. And Atkin found that this was rooted in a radio advertising campaign from the 1930s that originated the phrase, "Now you're cooking with gas." This phrase that has now become an idiom in English for just generally being like successful, turning it up, efficient, pumping up the intensity, doing something really well, right? That was literally just Bob Hope being paid to record 30-second long advertisements that featured him saying that in his voice at the height of like Bob Hope fame. Like Road to Zanzibar just came out and he's doing these gas stove advertisements, and it's early enough in the history of advertising that nobody knows how to be skeptical of advertising yet. And I think we are in a similar stage of AI-enabled nudging where people are only just beginning to figure out how to be skeptical of the recommendation algorithm, right? Because now we hear, one of the reasons that advertising agencies are kind of in a crisis right now, and they're losing a lot of clientele, and agencies tend to be people tend to be questioning the effectiveness of ad campaigns in conventional circles, is that there's a critical mass of people in our society who, when they see advertisements, they know that these are biased messages. They know that these are just messages specifically designed to sell you a product. And so unless it is the something they're already organically interested in, they turn off, right? And it's interesting because I can watch my children interact with advertisements now, and I see the much more naive way that small children interact with advertisements. And as they get older, they learn that these things are not necessarily true, right? But when we were first exposed to the medium, we didn't know how to be skeptical. And I think we're just in an era where recommendation algorithms and AI interactions are particularly persuasive to us because they are new enough technology that we have not figured out how to be skeptical towards them yet and how that skepticism works. And that was a much longer discussion on my part, or rant on my part, than I think I was planning to say. But I think if we're going to talk about, the power of algorithms in our society, I think we have to have a sense of empowering ourselves, and how education about these things can empower ourselves to kind of, fight back against simply being passive against them.
No, for sure. I mean, I think the media literacy question is a really important one, or the AI literacy question, or, how people interface and situate these technologies in contexts. I mean, one of the other things we were talking about in some of those notes, right, was again this idea around, so okay, if we say that the machine or machines or these technologies live, let's say, alongside us, and they're not just these tools that kind of, we just use at our will, that are passive, and we want to talk about emotion AI, this question of around, like, let's say empathy, right? And like, okay, does a machine have empathy, and what does that mean? And there's this question of maybe a genuine empathy versus a simulated empathy. And so does the machine have a genuine empathy in the sense that it can kind of interpret your emotional state and give you prescriptions? Maybe not, but maybe it can have a simulated empathy in the sense that it can give you some of that feedback. And that can be a really great positive development if you have good media literacy. Because then you can situate that feedback, recognize that it's still simulated, right? But a mirror giving you simulated, diffracted, bent backwards feedback is still useful in fixing yourself up on the way out the door, But you just can't take it as a one-to-one representation of reality. Then it's not going to be useful, because you'll see that the lettering on your shirt is backwards, Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, that's one of the things I really want to capture, and talk about a little bit more, this idea of to what degree and to what level of accuracy can an artificial intelligence software, mimic empathy? Because if we're going to look at, what's going on under the hood and what these machines are, they are inherently different from the way humans are built, especially on emotional questions, right? Human emotion is more a neurochemical issue than anything else, and a perceptual motor issue than anything else, right? There is no machine learning process that is equivalent to the neurochemistry of the amygdala and its associated systems and effects on the rest of our brains and bodies, right? What there is software systems that analyze enormous amounts of data for correlations that can better attune their responses to your emotional expressions, such that you learn something important and actionable from those expressions. And maybe those mirrors and those mimics, the best way to use them for mental health and therapy related applications is as this kind of feedback mirror for your own self-understanding. Because again, one of the myths of AI is that they are replicating and building something superior to humans. And I think one of the ideological problems with a lot of the business culture and technical culture and engineering culture that is developing artificial intelligence is that because they have been working with machine intelligence for so long, and if you look back at the history of cybernetics, conceiving of organic life and human thought and the components of organic thinking and perception as machine learning like, and as the creation and reinterpretation of codes, that has become something that they have reduced the neurochemistry of emotion and the experience of emotion to, instead of trying to effectively engage. There is a notion that they are trying to replicate.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And it's, again, the question of, like, how can we effectively code emotion and subjectivity into AI and consciousness when we can't even articulate and verbalize what those things are? How could you possibly make an algorithm for it? I always give the example to my students of, like, describe how to walk. It's like, you can walk, sure, you can all walk fine, but the actual process is very hard to articulate. Like, how am I even making it go, So when you break it down to that layer of, like, how would you actually make this a series of commands and prompts that you try and make something else actualize? If we, how would you reduce consciousness to that, if we can't even do that in language, how are we can do that in code?
Yeah. And it's because the code itself, at the very least, like machine learning code, because it's one thing to look at, say, genetic codes and protein structures and the interaction between protein structures as being, codes articulated at different macro and micro levels, and there being parallelisms of structure between, say, DNA and proteins, and parallelisms of structure between DNA, proteins, and all of the systems that produce our sort of phenotypical traits, right? Your height, the shape of our beards, our hair, our nose shape, skin color, propensity to develop heart disease by the time we hit 75, right? All of those traits, right? There are ways in which we can understand that as codes interacting with codes, interacting with codes. But the question is, are we accidentally, in our understanding of this, oversimplifying the code-based nature of certain aspects of human life and of, as I was saying on the last episode of the podcast, organic life? I'm not even talking about the humans. Because let's be fair, if we're talking about emotions, we're talking about like basically every animal.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting challenge. It's an interesting space, like there's so much potential there in that integration of these things that don't often make sense to go together, right? This like hyper rational imagined logic of the machine world and the sort of irrational flows of emotive space, and I think trying to combine those things, it often feels like a water and oil type problem where you're sort of like, how do you actually get these things to work together in symbiotic ways that aren't flattening? Right? Because the act of processing, interpreting is always going to reduce complexity. The act of us both trying now to use language to describe our thoughts is already reducing what we're thinking, and I wonder how much of that reduction is taking place in this space too. And, the challenge is always like, it has to almost evolve in tandem with some of the technical limits and capacities at a material level too. Like we said before, like the tech has to be cheap and durable and affordable and ergonomic. And if it isn't those things, like, there's a threshold and people won't take it up.
Yeah. You're just not going to get the data necessary if the sheer inconvenience of getting the data becomes so cumbersome that we can't take this on without already being incredibly emotionally committed to it, even just simple things like securing a podcast guest is sometimes a complex negotiation between building enthusiasm and convenience, right? Some people are willing to, drive across town in ridiculous traffic to get to a recording session on time. And some people are like, no, right? And that's something that every podcast host goes through, especially when they're working out of a fixed studio. And it's something that, is not only common to everybody in the media and journalism space, but it's common to every bit of human experience and human desire. Right? How do you overcome the reluctance? How do you make something convenient enough for people to incorporate it into their lives? And something as tricky and difficult as trying to build an AI system that can convincingly act in an empathetic way. Like, there might be so much data that you need to collect for that. And you have to be so careful about how all of it is interpreted. The amount of I honestly, there's a tendency in what I call Silicon Valley thinking to presume that the solution to problems are much simpler than they really are. An example that I can think of is some of the failures around the Sidewalk Labs project here in Toronto, where we filmed the New Intelligence and where we are all based. Which was Google's attempt to build a smart city that would have been incredibly convenient for everyone, but involved so many embedded sensors in the architecture of the community that it amounted to, number one, a hilariously intense invasion of privacy if the whole thing had actually been built. And number two, just, yes, it would have been convenient, but there were so many other issues about potentially being, people who did not have the means to participate in sharing data being shut out of the community was another issue too.
Well, I think this for me is the primary question always, right? It's just like the future is already here, right? It's just not evenly distributed, like the films that we grew up watching, all those science fiction films are set now in the 2020s, We have many of the technologies that those films could only imagine. The problem is just that we all don't have access to those things, right? Yeah, it's just, there's those inequities and those hierarchies are just being remapped onto this space.
Yeah. And it's the thing that I want to touch on when it comes to the question of empathy, especially in what will be the last probably 15 minutes of the show or so, is this question of, you brought up, and I hate to say it because this means that it's the inevitable thing that always gets talked about when it comes to artificial intelligence. It's the test, right? Yeah. And I'm going to say it right now. I don't believe in the test anymore. I don't believe that the test is a real sign that there is intelligence going on in there, right? Mainly because I have seen the results of systems like ChatGPT that are kind of able to pass various versions of the Turing test. And there's a lot of versions of the Turing test, a lot of interpretations of what Alan Turing actually defined as the test. I have seen some interpretations that are simply like, can you act enough like a human for someone to be able to tell the difference in the meantime? Or can you actively form the intention to deceive a human about who you are? Right, and other kinds of interpretations like that. Or in this case, can you build a system that is so good at mimicking empathy that a human cannot tell the difference, is one question. And the second question is such a good mimic of empathy itself an empathetic agent? I want your thoughts on the second question first.
I mean, I would say yes. I would say if you can't tell the difference, there probably isn't one. And I think, especially in this context where it's people's everyday lives are already, I would say, probably experiencing less and less empathy in their kind of everyday world than they would even 10, 30, 40 years ago, right? So it's almost like the threshold for how to empathize, especially post-COVID, I would say, is quite reduced. People in public spaces aren't quite as kind to each other. And so it's almost like we're so starved for empathy that even this baseline, which is deficient, that some of these machines these AI processes can give to us, is almost gonna satisfy people. And I don't think that's a good thing per se, because it's almost lowering the baseline.
Yeah. My faith in humanity is completely gone. I no longer have it anymore. 15 years ago, it used to be around 80 to 85%. By the time I got to 35 and had gone through some kind of negative experiences in life, it was down to around 50. Now I'm 4-5% on a good day. And I think, to a degree, that's kind of what happened to everybody, no matter what your perspective was. Whether you were sitting at home appalled at the sight of the January 6th insurrection and the Freedom Convoy occupation we had here in Canada, or else you were in those events themselves, or a willing supporter or participant, right? Either way, your faith and your trust in the ability of other humans to empathize or to even consider other humans worth being respected as people has reduced so much that even a mimic of empathy is enough to give us a comforting hug relative to the disconnected world we now live in. I feel like, I used to consider the bowling alone problem of all of our sort of third spaces and clubs and leagues and everything starting to disappear, and a lot of our free time starting to disappear. I used to consider that, a kind of important but low intensity problem. Now I would consider the world that Bowling Alone depicts to be kind of a paradise.
Yeah, it sounds utopic at this point. Yeah,
in terms of even the things that he was complaining about, the little bits of social connection and trust we could have in each other. Even in that kind of starved environment he was describing, we have now lost even so much of that. And I'm just speaking as a North American, but my perception is that this exists almost everywhere in the world, especially in the effects of, not just COVID itself, but really our reaction to COVID. Like, is there a way for applications of artificial empathy agents to help us get this back, this ability to understand people with charity and some kind of acceptance? Because to me, the real problem is sort of like, who is going to back down first, right? Who is going to back down first? Because there's a kind of confrontation between all of us in society now, especially as we've landed on different sides of these different divisions. It's not so much about doing whatever it takes to come together, because, if for example, you have a family full of queer people, right? A non-binary kid, a pansexual spouse, a gay uncle in like the longest long-term relationship you can possibly imagine. Can you come back together in some kind of social solidarity with a person who believes that all of those people need to be destroyed without them being the one to back down first?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge becomes helping the people to understand, like, locate where the problems are. I think in a lot of ways, and I talk about this a lot in my own work, that like, it's always framed the fact that everybody is really anxious and depressed is a huge problem, and we're just in big trouble. And I look at that and I'm like, that's absolutely true. But the fact that everyone's anxious and depressed is a huge opportunity, because it speaks to the fact that it cannot possibly be an individual problem. It cannot possibly be based on one's deficient brain or bad biochemistry, because everybody feels it. It's a contagion that is spread everywhere, So I think it's a question of like locating where the problem is. And I think even though it's something we've been trying to do for some time, it's kind of the age-old thing of like, the problem isn't like the new neighbors that just moved in from like some new country who are trying to make it in Canada. That's not the reason that your life is tough. The problem is all these corporations taking all this money, all this inequity, all this injustice, right? So I think it's helping redefine where the problems of the ire are coming from, and like realizing that like we're all these victims being exploited by this larger process. And that can be a form of leverage if we kind of reconceptualize our relationship to it, I think.
Yeah. And what can empathy training do? Even if it is just with computer simulated empathy, what can empathy training do to kind of rework some of those muscles? What are some of the first stirrings to reactivate our ability to empathize with others? And I'm not even talking about the question right now of, does the computer have empathy? Is the machine truly empathetic? Or is it a tool by which we develop it? I'm going back to the tool use now question and just being like, what do we want to use this tool for, right? Because there will be some applications of empathy mimicking AI that is just about this kind of individual therapy, to kind of give an individual person space to get their mind back together from the broken space it was in, right? But can there be further applications of these empathy flexing tools that we have in emotion-based or emotion simulating AI that has the power to sort of reactivate our social muscles as well?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it all comes down to like situating emotions in contexts. So if you can have these technologies that can help you either map your emotions or interface with these machines to talk about your emotions, help you recognize, like I was wearing this device and all the times I was having these negative experiences were like on my commute to work, or in my space at work, or in my negative home space with my roommate or my spousal challenge or whatever it is, right? And help kind of situate like the things that we feel are part of the lived environment and not just our little own interior worlds. And I think that's a really big part of it. I think there's a lot of potential in helping to externalize that suffering, not to project it, but to just take it outside of this thing that makes it our fault and situate it. And I think when you have technologies that can help you do that, it can just help us overcome some of those like anxiety spirals that you get caught in, you know? And so, yeah.
Yeah. Because I mean, the whole idea of mimicking emotions and mimicking an emotional interlocutor, right? One of the things you could be training the algorithm to do is intervene in those spirals to break the process and to provide just a stimulation back to you, right? Because one of the issues with machine learning software and this orientation to it is that it only sees human interaction as the exchanges of stimulus. But there are certain situations, even though it's not adequate to the full breadth of human experience, obviously, there are situations where the trigger of an empathy-producing experience or the trigger of a stimulus that blocks an anxiety spiral from like passing that threshold of constant dissent is a necessary effect to bring our minds back to where we can actually be social agents again.
Well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, right, anxiety is generated by a feeling of a loss of control. And so if we have technologies that can help generate a sense of control, both in our everyday lives around like the tasks that we have and our families and our home lives, but then also pushing it to that larger social context, the control over the decline of our health systems and political systems and economic inequality and climate change. And, you know, if we can also leverage control over those things as well.
For sure. All of these things can be are extremely necessary. And I mean, I hope I've at least given you a good idea now to apply an empathy system, or that we've helped develop a good idea to apply an empathy system here, and to see its uses not just as individual therapy, but also as a form of social healing to bring us back from the hateful attitudes that that many of us have embraced. And from the, you know, on one hand, the hateful attitudes, and on the other hand, the hopeless attitudes, because sometimes the hatefulness and the hopelessness articulate each other in the same way, which is rage. And so they become indistinguishable. But just like understanding artificial intelligence properly, you need to understand better what's going on underneath the surface appearance of, say, an AI application, like we said earlier, are tens or maybe even hundreds of different companies developing small different components and contributing all those components to a larger, more complicated assemblage, right? And in the same way, right, all of these components of our personalities and the software architecture we get to help manage them are these elements that these extra elements of complexity under our seeming unity on the surface and the extra causes that we don't see. I think we have now run out of time and come to something of a natural conclusion for this podcast. So I want to thank you, Adam Kingsmith, for coming by. I know it was especially convenient for you.
Yeah,
if we can go back to
I
the
was
original.
teaching on campus today. But yeah, thank you for having me. It was great to be here and to have this conversation.
Yeah, of course. And I'll be glad to have you back, anytime it's convenient. We can get good topics and good times for it. Thank you so much. New Intelligence Podcast, you've been listening to it and or watching it. And it is available through 25th Century, the magazine, the website, the platform, the concept, all of that. Thank you all very much. And my name is Adam Riggio, your host. And thank you all for being here and paying what little attention you did.